One of the major differences between land-based cases and ship piracy cases is that in almost all of the cases, ship piracy cases, we know exactly where the vessel is. But the problem is, how are we going to recover the vessel, short of some kind of a naval assault? But the problem is that those are the situations in which most hostages get hurt or killed. And so there has to be a political will. There has to be a military presence that is there to and trained and ready to do that kind of thing. And again, those are the most risky times for hostages because that's where they tend to get killed, is when the bullets start flying. If you've ever seen the TV show The Sopranos, then you've seen where I grew up. Not the nice part where Tony was from, but actually closer to where the pork store was. I was born in New York, but grew up in northern New Jersey. And in 1976, my father, who was an economist, was transferred for a year or so to Venezuela, Caracas, Venezuela, and we all went with him. And it was there that I was exposed the first time to kidnaps for ransom. There was a kid in my school whose father had been kidnapped for ransom, and it started my interest, certainly my knowledge of it, my awareness of it. And ever since then, it's been a topic of, fascination and professional endeavor. I became a hostage negotiator because I'm 6'5". When I was an undergraduate and I had finally decided what I wanted to do for a living when I grew up, which was to be a psychologist, a friend of mine said, "Why don't you go to this hospital and see if they'll give you a job so you can try out this psychology business?" And I went, and they did, and they gave me the job very quickly. And it wasn't until later that I found out why, and it was because they wanted me to be one of the heavies to jump on the patients when the patients were, throwing chairs around the unit. And what I found is that I enjoyed that. I liked it. I didn't like the violence particularly, but what I liked was the adrenaline of it. It was a little bit like being a fireman. There were certain messages that were broadcast over the PA system all over the hospital. I remember one of them was Dr. Strong to the accept unit, and the people who had been assigned to go, and I was usually one of them, from each ward would converge on the accept unit, right? Like I said, I liked it. And what I found over the years was that I could more often than not, de-escalate the situation simply by talking to them. Sometimes it felt like I had a kind of a pipeline into their heads. I don't know what it says about me. It was a mental hospital after all. But I did feel like I understood in many cases what the situation was, what was really going on, as opposed to just the tip of the iceberg stuff that you see. And I was able to understand what was going on at a deeper level and thereby de-escalate the situation and without having to physically intervene. One thing I can tell you is that the hostage negotiation team headquarters at One Police Plaza in New York, and the one that I used to work at Scotland Yard, is that if you could somehow get beamed like Star Trek style from one department to the other across the Atlantic, they looked almost exactly the same. The only difference was the accents. The same sort of cream-colored beige paint on the breeze block walls, too many people, too many filing cabinets in too small a space, similar smells. It was kind of uncanny. And the nice thing about working with hostage negotiators on both sides of the Atlantic is that they're, without exception, very dedicated people. Nobody becomes a police officer to get rich or to do anything for themselves. They're very community-minded. And as a hostage negotiator, one of the main values that underpins what the work you do is that life is valuable and worth saving. The Hackney siege started when the car of a man named Eli Hall was found, I think, a few days before Christmas, and it had been involved in a gun crime, if I remember correctly. And they watched it for 3-4 days, and then nothing happened. And then they figured, let's rattle the cage a little bit, see what happens, and they started to tow it. And at that point, my understanding is that Eli Hall started firing a pistol out of his window, and the Hackney siege started on Boxing Day in 2002. If memory serves, it became the longest siege in modern UK history, lasting, I think, about 17 days. So it lasted 2 weeks, 15 days or so, from the end of December to early January. And I worked on that in a support role, providing psychological analysis, profiling, and suggestions for negotiations and that kind of thing. I usually worked midnights to 8 in the morning, which is never fun, but given the fact that hostage negotiation is perhaps the most intellectually stimulating thing you can do, it was okay. If I remember correctly, Eli Hall was shot and killed by an armed Metropolitan Police officer after having fired at the police officer. And then he died as a result. So from my perspective as a hostage negotiator, it was not a fully satisfactory case. It was an okay case in the context of he didn't kill anybody else. But an ideal resolution of that case would have been to have apprehended Eli Hall and to have him, face justice. From my perspective as a hostage negotiator, a successful case is when all of the lives are preserved, all of the lives that are involved, whether it be hostages and or kidnappers. And obviously any other people involved. A hostage negotiation failure, such as it is when there is loss of life or significant injury. But the way I think about it is a little bit like, I guess, what an oncologist feels about cancer. I might be able to cure the cancer. I might be able to make your life better, improve your quality of life. But in the end of the day, if you die, it's the cancer that killed you, not the doctor. There are various categories of kidnaps globally. You've got your kidnaps for ransom, which economic or commercial kidnaps where the person is being held or the people are being held for some kind of financial or other gain, okay? Then you've got your political/religious kidnaps where the kidnappers are trying to extract some kind of concession from a third party, for example, a government. So you might, the Israeli and Hamas situation right now is a good example of a political/religious kidnap in which people have been kidnapped in order to try to affect or alter the behavior of some third party, in this case, the Israeli government. And then you've got kidnaps that are, or siege situations that develop as an outcome of a crime. For example, somebody who's robbing a bank, they get barricaded in, and now they've got a bank full of bank employees, and now they're barricaded in there, like the case in Sweden. It's been my experience that the Stockholm Syndrome is an intuitively appealing idea. Another term for it is called hostage identification syndrome, in which the hostages identify with their captors. And it seems to me to be an adaptive or a way of behaving and of approaching the kidnappers that increases your likelihood of surviving. In other words, if you can't beat them, join them. But it's been my experience in both cases that I've helped resolve and or the cases where I've dealt with the post-kidnap psychological aspects of it, that it doesn't really exist. I've never met a hostage who wouldn't have liked to choke crap out of their kidnapper. There was a case where a bank robber, he was trying to rob a bank, and then there was if I remember correctly, a romantic involvement or something approaching it with one of the hostages. That was the initial story. But my understanding is that subsequent to that, in the years following that case, the hostage, she's talked about how that's not what I said or that's not what I did. It's a complicated story and it's not as simple as it seems. Though, like I said before, the whole idea of the Stockholm Syndrome is intuitively appealing. In the kidnap for ransom insurance industry, there are a variety of people who would hire me. And so the clients would vary from the families or companies of individuals or groups of people who've been taken hostage. Also security companies who have been contracted by the company or the family to provide security, and they need an asset like me to help them achieve a safe outcome. People have said to me, doesn't paying ransoms in K&R cases promote kidnapping? And it doesn't seem to me to be a useful question. For the same reason that, does car insurance make you drive like a maniac? No, of course not. It helps you in the event that you have an accident. And so from my perspective, a successful outcome is where we pay for the release of the hostage and we achieve the successful and safe release of the hostage or hostages. How do you compare life to an amount of money? What's the number? How much is a human life worth, right? Especially if it's your relative or someone you love. Most of us would pay pretty much anything we've got in order to get those people back. It's making the best of a bad situation. The biggest sum of money that I've ever seen paid for a ransom is, it's in the millions, it's in the tens of millions of dollars for a ship piracy case. They're a little bit different in many respects to land-based kidnaps. Piracy cases off the coast of Somalia are much less prevalent now than they were in the middle of in the 2010s or so. The phenomenon has moved elsewhere. They still occur. They often don't make it into the press because from our perspective as negotiators, if a case makes it into the press, it's often a complicating factor that lengthens the time in captivity. One of the major differences between land-based cases and ship piracy cases is that in almost all of the cases, ship piracy cases, we know exactly where the vessel is. But the problem is, how are we going to recover the vessel, short of some kind of a naval assault? But the problem is that those are the situations in which most hostages get hurt or killed. And so there has to be a political will. There has to be a military presence that is there to and trained and ready to do that kind of thing. And again, those are the most risky times for hostages because that's where they tend to get killed, is when the bullets start flying. It's been my experience that governments never pay. Not only that, they really don't want anything to do with it. I've literally had cases where I've walked down the hall in a consulate in a country once, and the person that I needed to talk to about getting my hostage a new passport, because he'd been kidnapped with his passport and who knows where it was, they weren't going to return him with it. They turned around and ran away when they saw me coming, because governments don't want to be seen as helping or supporting or being of any help to kidnappers. Why? Well, because if it gets out that government X pays ransoms, then nobody from that country will ever be safe again. Governments will often turn a blind eye when somebody like me shows up. The work I do is not illegal in most countries. There are a few in which it is illegal, but like anything else in this world, it's a little bit, it's possible to operate in those countries as well. The most dangerous places to work were places like Iraq, Afghanistan, lots of different places in the Middle East, most of the former Soviet republics. If somebody called me today and said, Jim, could you do a case in Moscow? I'd say absolutely not. I'll work it from anywhere but Moscow. I'm not going to go in there because the Russian government at this point is, well, who knows what to say. But the point is that I wouldn't go just because it would be excessively dangerous. And in my business, you've got to follow the first rule of rescue, which is don't become the second victim. My Spanish was of enormous use because when I started off in the K&R side of the business, most of the work was in Central and South America. Colombia, as you may remember, was a famous place for getting kidnapped, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. Kidnaps happened in almost every country in South America over the years. But after the Second Iraq War, lots of the work moved east to the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, places like that. The first kidnap for ransom case I ever did was of a 15-year-old boy who'd been kidnapped. And the first job that I had to do was to try to convince his mother to let the case last longer than she wanted it to. Like any normal mother, she wanted her son to come back immediately, right now. But that could have caused a situation in which the kidnappers would get the mistaken idea that, well, these people are easy. Let me kidnap the other kid 2 months from now. And so one of the things we need to do is essentially make the kidnappers work for their money. Because if kidnappers were so industrious and such hard workers, they wouldn't be doing this business at all. And so if the thought occurred to them to kidnap somebody else, they'd say, oh, no, that family made us work too hard for this, so let's find somebody easier. That's one of the things that kidnappers and pirates are trying to do, is they're trying to find the easy prey. They're not interested in being challenged. The boy got out, and I'm happy to tell you that by the time the case ended, they were so sick of him and his adolescent will that they were glad to be rid of him. And I was so proud of that kid because he tortured those guys more than they tortured him. Well, you might be interested to learn that just like you've got regional variations in cuisine, you've also got regional variations in how much a kidnap costs. So, for example, a case in Mexico City, the Distrito Federal, a case will cost X. A case in Afghanistan will cost Y, and it'll last, say, for example, from days to weeks, whereas a case in Iraq it's more likely to last days. There are markets all over the world. And the market in Mexico is different than the one in Colombia, and the customs and expectations vary as well. And so the cost of a kidnap is going to vary as well. Well, kidnapping is a criminal activity, and it's often difficult to figure out who the kidnappers are. Are they part of a kidnap gang, or are they part of a drug cartel, or what? From my perspective as a negotiator, it doesn't really matter too much because the origins of that group aren't particularly important. In an ideal world, I might know something about their history because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. But at the end of the day, a kidnap for ransom is about getting the ransom. They don't need the guy or the person who's been kidnapped. They don't need the hostage. What they need is the money, or what they want is the money.
Hi, welcome to Deep.
This channel goes a level deeper.
Deep is a brand new YouTube channel that is dedicated to the amazing experiences of incredible individuals.
We basically try and answer the questions that you always want the answer to, but you don't feel like you can ask.
Myself and the team are responsible for a lot of the factual content that you might have seen on YouTube, Minutes With, The Gap, Agree to Disagree, among others. And we set up this new studio and this new channel to go a level deeper.
We will be uploading a new video every single week.
There'll be a wide range of stories, so please hit the subscribe bell.
Please let us know in the comments if there's anything you want us to cover, any stories that you've been interested in, any questions you wanted to ask.
We hope you enjoy. Now back to our story.
Well, I suppose it's useful and perhaps interesting to note some of the differences between different regional and national approaches to kidnaps. So, for example, the Moscow embassy siege, the Russians tend not to negotiate at all. Zero, nada, full stop. They won't do it. But in that case, as we know, many hostages were killed. Of course, I've discussed at length with members of the NYPD and the Metropolitan Police's hostage teams about introducing things like anesthetic gas, which is what they did in the Moscow theater siege. And the bottom line is that there are too many variables. As we saw in the Moscow theater siege, many of the hostages died from the anesthetic, and the other ones that were killed by the rescue attempt or the kidnappers. And that's an example of a politically motivated kidnap, essentially. And those can often be the most difficult to resolve because governments, as we've discussed, don't usually negotiate or deal with hostage takers. And so they're often willing to pay the price, the short-term price for the longer-term gain. They're often willing to sacrifice a smaller number of people in the hope that this will send the message to kidnappers that we don't deal with hostage takers, and that tends to keep nationals of that country safe. Just as you've got cultural variations in all kinds of human attributes, I think that if the Moscow theater siege had happened in New York, it would have been handled very, very differently. The press and other scrutiny would have been much higher, and it would have been a very, very complicated case. Though one thing that I can say is that in general, time is on our side as negotiators. People tend to get more realistic, less excited, less anxious ideas, fantasies that people might have about what the outcome is going to be. They get tempered by reality and time. And so in general, statistically and certainly in my experience, the longer a case goes on, the higher the chances of a safe outcome. All kinds of psychological processes have time to develop and establish themselves in a longer case. The most dangerous cases are the short, sharp ones, in which there isn't time, for example, for the hostage to humanize themselves or for the hostage takers to relax, to be able to think. Because when you're extremely anxious, when all the adrenaline's flowing, thinking is less possible. And so those are the most dangerous cases, the short, sharp ones. A lot of people think that being a hostage negotiator is about talking people out of situations in which they're in, or talking the hostage takers to release the hostages. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, but it's much more accurate to say it's not about talking them out, it's about listening them out. Why? Well, because if you don't understand what is motivating the hostage taker, then how do you expect to be able to deliver what they want in a way that maximizes the safety of the hostage and of the hostage takers as well? Because if the hostage takers feel like they're under threat, they're more likely to A, abuse the hostage, or B, they're much more difficult to negotiate with. They're much more difficult to deal with. With the advent of the internet and social media and technology and things like that, thankfully, it's not necessary to go into country much of the time. I've been able to, for example, to work cases in the Middle East from London. You just got to manage the time zones and things like that. In general, the closer you get, the better, because local or close to local knowledge and resources are extremely important to be able to deploy and understand what local conditions are. For example, are the police in this town or this city or this country, are they corrupt? Is it possible that they're part of the problem, or are they competent and not corrupt, et cetera? I only speak English and Spanish, and so if, for example, I'm working a case in which the language is Arabic, I'll often use family members carefully chosen to be the communicator who will actually do the speaking to the hostage takers. This is somebody who is psychologically strong, alert, robust, perhaps distant ones, not people who are direct related to the kidnapper, as assets, as communicators or other functions in the crisis management team. For the same reason that doctors are not supposed to treat their own family members. It reduces objectivity, things like that. Or what I'll do in lots of cases is, if I don't speak the language myself, I'll have somebody on the team who speaks the language that the communicator is working in without the knowledge of the communicator. Somebody might speak Arabic, but the communicator might not know. And so this way, there's a sort of a double blind. That's in extreme cases where we're not sure who's who. And very often we'll just have other people on the team who speak the language, and then I'll get reports from them after the call, for example, to find out if I want to know exactly the message that got delivered. Was it what we asked them to deliver, or did they go off script? These are the points that we want you to make in this call. This is how much money we have today. Things like that. One of the most important messages early on that we give is, we will pay, but you've got to take care of our guy. And oftentimes, if necessary, I'll ask the communicator to repeat that message up to 10 times, and make sure that before you get off the call that you repeat this 10 times, because I want to make sure that they get the message. In the excitement of the phone call, especially early on, there's a lot of commotion, it's very hectic, and so I want to make sure that they absolutely get the message that we will pay, but you've got to take care of our guy. And what I'm doing there, obviously, is linking the safe outcome of the safe return of the hostage with what they want, which is money. Yeah, I've had to deal with cases in which the family wanted to, or parts of the family wanted to hire an astrologer. That was a toughie to provide me with advice. Well, Mexico is a good example. The police are, for better or for worse, famously dodgy, frankly. It's hard to tell whether they are actually corrupt or are they actually competent and not corrupt. In fact, some years ago, there was a case where the specially developed and designed unit to deal with kidnaps had been infiltrated by one of the cartels, and they started being part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. And this is true in lots of countries in which you don't know who is corrupt or who's feeding information to the kidnappers. Managing kidnaps is often, it's an information management exercise. Who knows what is the perception here, things like that. My longest professional negotiation case is 5 or 6 months long, but I don't work all of it because after a few weeks, you start losing your sense of humor and your perspective. And so what we try to do is rotate in about every 3 or 4 weeks with myself and other response consultants to help to manage it. It is a job where you're usually on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because of course the kidnappers don't hold normal office hours for when they make calls or for when developments happen or communications happen. And so if you're kind of on for 3-4 weeks, you start getting tired. And so that's why we rotate through. Well, how do I keep myself going? First of all, is that recognizing that my work has direct implications for the preservation of human life, which does tend to focus the mind, but also rotating through, managing my own energy levels and sleep and things like that is extremely important. We try to follow the first rule of rescue, which is don't become the second victim. I personally manage the stress. I have various methods that I use, including I meditate. The nice thing about meditation is that it manages the stress, and it's not like having a couple of drinks, which means that you might be impaired in terms of getting from the hotel to the office where if you need to go at a moment's notice. And it does refresh me at all kinds of levels. Try to get as much sleep as I can. Sleep is really important, especially if you're staying in a hotel for 3 weeks at a time. And I don't know about you, but I rarely sleep as well in a hotel as I do at home, especially if I know the phone could ring at any moment. And so it's important to maintain and, eat well, try not to drink too much, things like that. The stress management stuff that all of us have to use in our daily lives in the 21st century. One of the things that it seems to me that all kidnappers have in common is that they're callous people. They wouldn't do it if they were sensitive to other people's needs and feelings, would they? They're cruel, they don't have regard for other people's lives, and they are the kind of people who don't necessarily feel guilt about the pain and suffering they cause other people. They're just after the money. In my experience, in Kidnap for Ransom, quite often the kidnappers will get away with it because Kidnap for Ransom is a function of semi-failed states, not fully failed states, because it's too chaotic even for the kidnappers to operate, and anybody who's worth kidnapping is going to be well protected. And kidnaps for ransom don't happen in the developed world for the most part because the police are competent and corrupt, and the kidnappers stand too high a chance of getting caught. So Kidnap for Ransom tends to be something that occurs in semi-failed states, in which oftentimes the civil structures of government and of the nation are impaired or not functioning. So it has to be a context in which the kidnappers think they're not going to get caught. Or if they do get caught, it won't be such a big deal. A good hostage negotiator has got to be interested in people. They've got to be somebody who is, to some degree, psychologically minded, somebody who wants to help and be of service to other people, somebody who can subsume or manage their own ego, for example, who can put their ego second or third or perhaps even last. Because kidnappers around the world, one thing they do have in common is that they'll use vile language, threats, etc. They'll insult you and your ancestors. And it's often tempting, especially if you're tired, to have to make a retort, to say something in return. Oftentimes, the major work, the labor that a hostage negotiator is doing is suspending the desire, the reasonable and not surprising desire to tell the kidnappers to go to hell. Unlike some movies and TV shows out there, as a hostage negotiator, I would never get involved romantically with somebody close to the case. One of the films about Kidnap for Ransom is one called Proof of Life. I think Meg Ryan and Russell Crowe were in it. That was accurate in many respects in terms of the detail of it. It's very inaccurate in the sense of by the end of the movie, they had to bring in guns and explosions and helicopters and people shooting each other. From my perspective as a hostage negotiator, I failed if that happens. But from a visual perspective, in terms of making a movie appealing to people, you've got to have a lot of visual stuff going on. From a visual perspective, a lot of the work that I do as a hostage negotiator looks like a meeting. And I've never been to a meeting where afterwards I said, boy, that was so terrific, I wish I'd videoed it. From a visual perspective, it's not that appealing. Inside Man is an excellent movie. It took place in New York, and I have friends and colleagues of mine who I know consulted on that. And they did quite a good job of showing some of the details of how police-type negotiations happen. It's not a kidnap for ransom case, it's a police negotiation case, and a lot of accuracy there. Generally in the Western world, like the NYPD and Scotland Yard's teams, their stated goal is to preserve life. So they will do whatever it's necessary to preserve life, with the major exception of not provide or not deliver substantive concessions. You're not going to release a lot of political prisoners by taking people hostage in New York or London. Kidnaps are as old as human beings. There are biblical stories of kidnap that have happened. I mean, kidnaps have been happening throughout human history. And one of the reasons that they work is that kidnap relies on the fact that human beings are social animals. We live in herds and flocks. So if I do something to you, you're affecting me. Dogs don't kidnap each other. Alligators don't kidnap each other. It's humans, and it relies on the fact that we are connected to each other. Even social animals don't kidnap each other, do they? So the point is that it relies, in effect, on the fact that human beings are socially deeply connected to each other. So the best way to avoid getting kidnapped is to gain some local knowledge before you go to places where kidnap might be a problem. Obviously, don't stray off the beaten path. Don't flash expensive jewelry, things like that. Adhere to local norms about covering yourself or not covering yourself, things like that. Absolutely. Local knowledge is extremely important. Don't try to stick out too much, because kidnappers and muggers and things, they're attracted to what sticks out, like everybody else, the thing that catches your eye. Well, one of the first things that you should do when you get kidnapped is to comply with the orders of the kidnappers. Don't fight them. Don't irritate them. Don't single yourself out for abuse or extra attention. You want to be essentially cooperative, because the end game here is to survive, not to be some kind of John Wayne hero. It doesn't have to be pretty. All you have to do is survive. And the fact is that at that moment, they have the upper hand. That's one of the major things that you should do to increase your chances of survival. One of the first things that you shouldn't do in the unfortunate case that you do get kidnapped is don't negotiate for yourself. If you're a hostage, if you've been kidnapped, you obviously don't have freedom of movement. It's not like you can go to the bank and get $100,000 out of the bank, can you? They're not going to expose themselves like that. It tends to add time to hostages' confinement if they start to negotiate for themselves, as tempting as that might be. It's important for hostages to remember that there are going to be people outside who are negotiating very hard and working very hard to secure their safe release. Well, so for example, if the kidnappers tell you to put a hood on, put the hood on. Don't give them an excuse to abuse you because you don't know how long you're going to be in captivity. Another tip is to eat food when it's offered because you don't know when you're going to be fed again. Drink water if it's offered. Make sure that you have some nearby. People are very, in general, are very vulnerable to getting dehydrated because many kidnaps happen in hot climates. It's important to take care of yourself, more so during the captivity than you might in the rest of your life, because you're undergoing an enormous stress, an unusual amount of stress, and so your body and your brain are going to react differently. So it's important to take care of yourself, to preserve yourself. In the event that there's a hostage rescue, it's one of the most dangerous points in any kidnap. Think about where you might want to go to protect yourself. Oftentimes a good place to go is if there's a cast iron bathtub, to get in it, because the cast iron might be strong enough to protect you against gunfire. Otherwise, find another place where it's more likely that you'll be safe than being exposed. I don't know, maybe in a closet or something like that. In other words, to think about the future and about what to do in the event of an emergency like a rescue attempt.